So good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to Patel Chapel. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Sharon Kugler and I serve as the Yale University chaplain and a committee member of the Yale Well Committee. Yale Well offers a framework for instilling habits of wellness in students and developing a strength of well-being and emotional intelligence. Yale Well identifies and supports pilot programs that use the expertise and interests of faculty, students, staff, and alumni. These projects teach skills not always taught in the classroom. Today, Yale Well is delighted to bring Edith Hall to campus to speak on how ancient wisdom can change your life. Edith Hall is a professor in the Classics Department at King's College London. She is a leader in the study of ethnicity, class, and gender in ancient sources, of ancient theater, and the continuing impact and use of ancient ideas in world culture. She's the author of several academic books and editor of many more. She also writes for the wider public, thank goodness, so some things I can understand. Her recent book, Aristotle's Way, was reviewed in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Time magazine. A particular review that spoke to me was written in American Scholar, and it said, in clear, patient language, Hall deftly weaves threads pulled from this daunting range of material into lessons that pertain directly to the dilemmas of modern life. We are told that Hall first encountered Aristotle when she was 20, and he changed her life forever. One of the book's strengths is her tone of unmistakable sincerity. I think we're in for a treat. Professor Hall will deliver remarks, and we'll have some time for questions and answers afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Edith Hall.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very warm welcome and for the invitation to come here. I haven't been to Yale for several years, and I always like coming here, and especially to Professor Emily Greenwood for organising the whole thing. Yes, I am a practising Aristotelian, I admit it. Quite what that actually means in everyday life is an interesting question. This is a sort of picture that I do have in my fantasies. In another life, I might have been a student at Aristotle's Lyceum, which was somewhere with a beautiful garden where scholars and students would meet and study with Aristotle. It's really the first, it's the first thing that we can recognize as a university as we know it in world history, in that it was a teaching institution for people of approximately undergraduate to sort of postdoctoral stages. It had a wonderful library. Aristotle had an extraordinary collection of his own books, and actually the way that he arranged them was provided the model for the great library at Alexandria. But something even more important, he surrounded himself with colleagues not just in philosophy, because he was a true polymath, the master of those who know, as Dante calls him. And so he had scholars of science and maths and physics and chemistry and biology and zoology, as well as philosophy and especially local history, constitutional history. And they gathered there. But at 5 o'clock in the afternoons, or at sort of sundown, Aristotle invited the general public who were interested in talking about ideas into the Lyceum every afternoon and would talk to them. He had a huge commitment to public outreach. In fact, published a great many books in very short form, short treatises, which he called the exoteric books, which just means the opposite of esoteric. Instead of inward-facing, it's outward-facing. So in very many ways, he is, apart from anything else, a fantastic role model for anybody in higher education in the 21st century. The picture that put me onto the Greeks as a child, onto all of them, was in fact in a children's magazine, the one on the right. It was called Look and Learn. I just thought I'd never seen anything so cool in my life as those guys standing around in the Lyceum talking about great and eternal truths. And my delight in the mid-1990s, when the Lyceum was actually discovered during excavations for the Athenian underground train system and has been properly excavated. And although those aren't the same flowers that bloomed there when Aristotle was talking to his closest colleague, the great botanist Theophrastus, who I like to imagine planted that garden, it's still a very beautiful place to go. It's right in the heart of Athens, a little bit east of the Acropolis, and much to be recommended. So I've been asked to talk about happiness because Aristotle's entire moral system has a goal in mind, which is the individual and collective eudaimonia, happiness, which can be achieved in a long-term sense. Actually, it can't really be achieved. It has to be created and recreated every day. It's more of a verb than a noun. It's a way of life, which is why I wanted to call my book Aristotle's Way, in a quite sort of gospel sense. It's a way of conducting yourself. And it takes a certain amount of, certainly intellectual commitment. There is just one ancient picture of personified happiness on this beautiful vase in the British Museum. But here we have actually the rather more populist view of what happiness is, in that she's got some nice jewellery, she's probably getting ready either for marriage or for meeting her husband, she's surrounded by symbols of erotic love and luxury. That is probably the popular idea of what happiness is, and it may well be the sort of popular idea that we have of happiness. Happiness is something that you're supposed to be able to get by buying a foreign holiday, going on a cruise, going to McDonald's to get a happy meal, going to a cocktail at happy hour, and so on. Or just getting to be incredibly rich, or just being madly in love. All of those sorts of things. This is absolutely not what Aristotle meant. For Aristotle, it was a commitment to trying to be the best possible version of yourself you could possibly be. That is, maximizing your whole potential, and in particular as a moral being, as an agent, and by working on yourself to try to make yourself a better version of you than you were before you started thinking about ethics. And he is absolutely he gives you absolute promise that if you do this in a sincere way and are very honest about your failings and work on them, that you will get to be a lot happier than you were before you did it. And I can only give you the empirical evidence of my own life that I discovered this 40 years ago when I was about 21, and it's worked for me. I think I am as happy as I could have been, given all the cards I was dealt, you know, the different things that happen, bad luck, good luck, all the rest of it. So I decided to write this book only about 3 years ago, actually because my agent, who I'd previously written a fairly standard history book about the ancient Greeks for, said, why are you always going on about what Aristotle would have said, what Aristotle would have done? Could you please just write it down? And I did in about 10 weeks. It didn't, except for the last chapter, which I couldn't finish, and I'll tell you about that later. He literally just said, just go and tape yourself talking and thinking aloud, because I think the world might like to buy this, and I'm your agent, so I'm interested in making money. Okay. Where we're going to start, the Aristotelian system of ethics is complicated. It's also an amazing network that comes out to encompass not only moral behavior, but biology, your attitude to your material environment, politics, your attitude towards your fellow citizens. And it's really quite hard to find an entry point. And you'll be pleased to hear that after going to quite a lot of schools to talk to 15-year-olds and 14-year-olds about this, I've decided that the best entry point is the political animal. It's that we're all animals. I'm not suggesting for a minute that your intellects are no more developed than those of 15-year-olds, but I find it easiest to start with this. So this was actually a completely revolutionary thing to think in the 4th century BC. That I am a Homo sapiens, I'm an anthropos, as the Greeks would say, and that means I'm an animal. That was not the way the Greeks thought at all. The ancient Greeks thought that they had been made specially by the gods and they were very different from animals, and a lot of their structural thinking is about being not animal, not wild. But Aristotle says, no, we are animals, we're just advanced ones. And then because he is actually the founding father of zoology, I don't know if there are any zoologists in this room, but you have to read Aristotle if you do zoology. He invented the entire system of classification according to different modes of reproduction, different modes of ambulation, respiration, that kind of thing. What he did was begin his question, what is a human and how can that human be happy, by saying what is different about the human animal, the politikon zoon, which was misquoted by President Trump in an altercation with the Pope a couple of years ago, but never mind. What is it different about us as a zoon, an animal, from all the others? Then we will know what it is to be human by a process of elimination. And he spent 2 years on Lesbos with his friend Theophrastus, who was from Lesbos, 17 years younger than him. And this is a Victorian zoologist's fantasy of them inventing botany on the one hand and zoology on the other. As far as I know, there are no lions or giraffes on Lesbos, but it's a very nice idea. These are just some of the many animals. The book I recommend, if you've never read any Aristotle before, the book I actually recommend you start with is his History of Animals. It's a joy to read. It's not difficult. It's all about wonderful stories about all the birds and bees and insects and horses and fish that he was very expert in and had talked a lot to hunters and gamekeepers and fishermen about. And he classifies them, and these are just some of the animals, like asses and bees that he was particularly keen on. And there's an awful lot about horses. And just before I go on to the classification and the human animal, I'd like to say I'm not going to talk much about politics today at all, but one of the great advantages of Aristotelian thought is that he is absolutely compatible with, and by a lot of people treated as, the founding father of an environmental approach. He's the perfect philosopher for 21st century green politics. And this particular scholar, who's a Turk called Ozguç Orhan, who I've been in touch with, because someone told him I was showing his picture on PowerPoint, has written a wonderful article explaining how Aristotle's approach to particularly production and sustainability is something that is a very good model. He doesn't believe that we should ever produce more than we need. He thinks that things start to go wrong when we have more commodities than we need. He also, fascinatingly to me, I found right there in one of his other, he wrote 4 treatises on animals that have survived. One of the other ones that survived, the first ever example of a human, of an animal, a species that has been rendered extinct by human activity. And he's very sad because the red scallop of the lake on Lesbos no longer exists, the fishermen have told him, because of over-dredging the base of the lake. So he's actually already sensitive to those issues. But he decides, and this is a very, very simple summary. I'm aware that there's at least one professor of philosophy who knows far more about Aristotle than I do in this room. I should say I did not do my doctorate on Aristotle. I did mine on Greek tragedy. These are the things that he thinks most distinguishes Homo sapiens from all our fellow animals. We like to live in communities, but there again he says so do some others like bees. We can develop, and he's terribly interested in friendship, strong friendship bonds with non-kin, and in fact they may be more important kinship bonds than those with biological kin. They may be a much more beautiful relationship. Crucially, we can reason, inquire, deliberate, and plan. This is an extraordinary capacity which, as far as we're aware, no other animal shares with us fully. And being able to reason, think about the future, make decisions, and particularly ask questions about the world. Just everything that we do here at university, that continuous process of wonderment and inquiry. And it's particularly important, I mean, the famous opening page of his Metaphysics is that all humans by nature yearn for knowledge. All humans, not, one race or one gender. It's humans desire and yearn for knowledge. We have this special capacity, which in a slightly mystical way, in some of the few very mystical bits of Aristotle, seems to be linked up with his idea of God, that we actually become most near what he imagines God, which is an intellectual capacity. We become most like God when we are fully activating our reasoning powers, because this is something very special about us. We can decide to acquire them, and then go out and acquire them, technai, competencies, skills. We can learn to mend cars. We can learn to analyse what happiness is. That is actually, he calls it just another techne, another skill or competence. And all of human life is about acquiring different competences, and different specialists have different ones. Though there are some techni we all need, like personal hygiene or ability to cook a decent meal. We, very importantly, in his works on memory, can recollect intentionally and purposefully. He has noticed that dogs, for example, can remember. Other animals have memory. It's quite obvious they do. If you take a dog for a walk, it often knows where to go the next time. Animals remember what time of day their meals will be served. They remember humans who are kind to them. They remember humans who aren't kind to them. But can they sit and say, do you remember 3 years ago when we went on this walk that there was a rainbow, right? Or shall we try and remember where all the water holes were when we were here last year? Probably not. Though I know that certain of the very advanced animals, we are now discussing a lot more what they're capable of. Humans' ability to activate conscious memory is, for individuals, an extraordinary power, and I will come back to that later. And very touchingly, he thinks that laughter is very human, which means it must be important. And he's very interested in laughter. He knows there's bad, cruel laughter, but actually laughter is an incredible gift, which he thinks only humans can do. Unfortunately, we've lost his famous treatise on comedy. So we are community dwellers. We have these strong bonds with people who include non-kin. We can reason, inquire, deliberate, and plan. We can decide to acquire competences, we can recollect intentionally, and we can laugh. That's a fantastic set of things. And Aristotle actually says that if that's the case, then that makes us more responsible than all the other animals. He says that human beings can be the noblest of all animals because of these incredible gifts, but it also gives us the capacity to do 1,000 times as much damage as any other animal. And I think that particular principle, that it's the gift is also the responsibility. This makes us responsible for all the other beings with whom we share the planet. And I'm much happier grounding all of this, not just in all the environmental catastrophe we're bringing on ourselves, but as we are, by dint of our intellectual capacity, we must be responsible for all the others. It's absolutely essential. Right, we are also born with two kinds of potential. And the word Aristotle uses for potential, it's one of the most exciting words in Aristotle, is dunamis, dynamis. It's actually the word that dynamite comes from. And I'm very upset that Alfred Nobel chose that word when he was wanting to label a highly destructive, explosive substance, because I would like to have a positive dynamite. This is the dynamite that could make the whole of the human race, as far as I'm concerned, far happier. And that is if every single anthropos on the planet were enabled to discover and fulfill their true potential. If they could do that, then our chances of great happiness would be serious dynamite. Right, we're born with two kinds of potential, every individual. And you'll notice I'm starting from the individual, the inside of the individual's head. This is something that is very, very different from the way you start to think about life with Plato, for example. It's very anthropocentric. You start with quite a subjective principle rather than starting with the city-state and working downwards. You start with the anthropos and work upwards through partnerships to build the city-state. So we were all born with the dunamis, or even from the moment of conception, the dunamis, to develop into an adult human rather than, for example, a mature oak tree or a swan. That is, we would now call it, we have our species basic DNA kit, right? He called it this special dunamis. He thought that it was imprinted somehow by the father's semen on the woman's internal matter. He didn't quite get the relationship between between mothers and DNA, but he got this idea that it was in there already from the minute of conception. But then we've also all got a dunamis peculiar to ourselves. And that might be to be a great gardener, parent, poet, cook, politician, pianist, singer, mechanic, engineer, doctor, teacher, or something else. But absolutely everybody has got something that they really ought to be growing up into being because they'll be good at it, right? And that is not determined by what their parents do. It's simply not. It's much more random than that. And the fundamental first step, in terms of trying to become an Aristotelian happy person, is to identify what it is that will make you fulfill become the very best possible version of yourself, and then fulfill it. Easier said than done, and I know I have very young adult children, and it's one of the hardest questions of all, and society's telling you all kinds of things, all kinds of pressures on you to be famous, or to be rich, or to be obedient, or to be this, that, and the next thing, or to take over your father's company. But it's crucial to try and listen and sense as hard as possible, just momentarily, during momentary actions, during chance encounters and experiences, what it is that gives you really good pleasure. And I don't mean eating or sex. I mean what activity in your daily lives gives you true satisfaction that you would like to develop, to actually get better and better and better at it, rather than just to enjoy it as a sensory experience. It's also very important, I think, to be patient. I did not figure out what I wanted to do till I was 27, at all. Good parenting and mentoring is, of course, essential, and we don't have enough of that. Nowhere near enough parents, even in highly developed worlds where people have got the luxury not to spend their lives merely eking out a subsistence to feed their children. Even where we have that luxury, the amount of bad parenting I see, just in terms of wrong pressure, right, instead of letting the child find their way. And the way to do that, I think, is by maximum exposure to lots and lots of different things, not by forcing people to have hundreds of violin lessons if they plainly don't like the violin. But I don't know a lot about it, but I'm assured by neurologists that there's a huge amount of evidence that the human brain is not fully wired up until 25. It's actually not fully wired up, which means that forcing people who haven't decided what they want to do before they're 25 is likely to have unfortunate results. Now, that does not fit with our current pressurized examination programs and so on. But I certainly know in my own case, I was about 27 when I really realized what I was good at and what I wasn't good at, and was able to decide what to do on that strength. Once you've found out what you want to do, you're going to have to be able to communicate directly and effectively. I'm actually really going through the chapters of the book. I try to cover most of Aristotle's really important books. And his rhetoric is one of the most influential textbooks on persuasion in world history. In fact, it's the first extant one we've got. But what's so important about it was that his teacher, Plato, was very much of the view that learning tricks, as he saw it, of speech, learning how to persuade people, was something that led to very specious, sophistic arguments, people spin doctoring, people being able to argue away from the truth towards untruth, or worse, towards really unpleasant agendas. But Aristotle opens the rhetoric, and again, he's very good at these rousing openings, and he says, I do not understand why we train our fellow humans to be able to defend themselves physically, right, with weapons or their bodies, and we do not train everyone to be able to defend themselves with their tongue, which in everyday life, he says, for ordinary people is far more important. Being able to make a coherent argument, defend yourself, further your interests and those of your dependents, defend yourself against persecution, advance your own interests, and indeed simply deliberate well. And in my chapter on rhetoric, I actually do it on a job application with a CV. You can actually reduce everything he says in the rhetoric to 4 principles. And I'm very pleased that in English that gets to A, B, C, D. Isn't that wonderful? It doesn't work, I'm being told by people translating my book into Arabic and Greek. But hey, and that is audience. Until you think about who is it who I am trying to persuade, what their emotions are like, what the emotional situation and relationship is between us, you are lost. And I know this very, very well as somebody who sometimes has to read 200 letters of application for a single one-year lectureship or something at King's College London. People who have not bothered to find out who will probably be reading that letter don't do very well. So audience research, whoever it is to, brevity as short as you can possibly be with the content, clarity at all times, and that's much harder to achieve than it sounds. And then delivery. And delivery can be everything from how you open an email to whether you, being a starving student, go and hire a well-cut suit for that job interview, right? Delivery is the 4th element, but it's incredibly important. When I get emails that say, hey, prof, I'm not well disposed towards the person who has opened that email with hey, prof. I don't particularly want distinguished madam either, but there is, if you're an Aristotelian, a mean between these two, and we should go on to that. But to fill our human potential, this is one of the greatest gifts, really, that Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics gave us, is the ability to deliberate effectively, and that is to make decisions. And we all have to take decisions all the time, far too many actually in modern life in terms of choosing between consumer goods and so on. Hardly anybody is trained at the right time, which I believe to be the sort of early teens, in the basic principles of good deliberation. And this means that people take disastrous decisions precipitately and without thinking through all the consequences. That is what happened with Brexit as a collective decision. But this is what happens when somebody leaves their spouse because somebody has told them that their spouse has been unfaithful, all right, the next day. This is not a good way of deliberating. And I have been rather brutal with Aristotle here because he's taking some information for granted from previous writers on counselling and deliberation. He also wrote a treatise on deliberation which has not survived. But implicit or scattered in his work on decision-making are these 8 principles. I'm leaving out the 9th, which is don't deliberate with women or when drunk, because obviously you wouldn't want to do either of those. Thank you, whoever laughed. Okay, first, take your time. Now, that has become, it sounds so obvious, but When I was a young thing, before email, when we actually had to write a letter and put it in the post, you would write the letter saying, I'm resigning and emigrating to Australia forthwith, or I'm leaving you, cutting off our children and going to a convent. I would write that letter, I would put it by the front door, I would go to sleep, I would get up, and I would throw it away in the bin. And I felt much better because I had done that with that emotion. What do we do now? We bang off that email. How many of you have done that? Don't. My husband will not let me answer emails after 8 o'clock in the evening because I have almost always had a glass of claret by 8 o'clock in the evening. He simply won't let me, all right? So that's why they had the Delphic Oracle in ancient Greece, because it took 10 months to get an appointment. By the time you got your appointment at the Delphic Oracle, the city, the state that you wanted to declare war on, right, had probably sent you a lovely present, right? It's very, very good principle. But more importantly, even than that, is verify all information. The amount of decisions that are taken on bad information, misinformation, lies, slander, just bad facts. We invaded Iraq, us Britons, on entirely false information that we were presented with by Tony Blair. Entirely false information. That decision was taken on in Parliament. If your best friend says that your boyfriend has been kissing someone else, do you believe him or her? You probably shouldn't, because if they're your best friend, they've already got a vested interest in your emotional life. They're the last person to believe, actually. What you should actually do is go and ask the person involved. These are two very extreme examples, but you know what? People do not think about it. You investigate precedents. What happens when NATO invades Iraq or Afghanistan or anything else? Let's look at history. You then look forward. You're using this brain. You calibrate likelihoods, all possible likelihoods. You write down every single possible likelihood, if it's a serious decision, of how everybody will react, what might happen, what might be there. And you still won't get them all, but you can try. You have to factor in random chance. There will be likelihoods you cannot possibly anticipate, definitely. But there are things that might well happen. The example I give in the book is if you're arranging a wedding, you do not know if you live in Britain whether it will rain or not. You simply don't know. But you do know it's very likely, which means, therefore, that you have an alternative venue for photographs indoors, supply some umbrellas, and have extra hairspray for the bride, right? You factor in randomness as far as you can. You consult disinterested co-deliberators. Now, because I'm speaking at an Ivy League university, I know I don't have to explain the difference between uninterested and disinterested. I do actually to most of my students at some point. You don't want somebody who's uninterested in your plight because they will go to sleep and not listen. But you want someone who has nothing whatsoever to gain or lose from you choosing either way. Right? Nothing, and that will not be your best friend. It might be a specialist marriage guidance counsellor. It can be very difficult to find somebody completely disinterested. But my word, it's important. And you can actually pay people to help you make decisions who have no personal investment. You consider consequences for every single party concerned. Even splitting up with somebody who you've only been out with 6 months will affect groups of friends and parents, siblings possibly, right? You think you have, you may have to discount it as not as important enough because it will affect your happiness not to make the decision you're going to, but you have to be prepared for the consequences on everybody. And lastly, be prepared to chuck it all in the bin and start again. And he's very big on this. You must be open to new data and prepared to redeliberate in its light. And it can be just new data, like what will actually happen to the customs union, our role in the customs union, which we didn't, things we didn't know, or it can be that the actual situation has changed. And I'm not going to go on about this much, but one of the reasons I am happy to do business with Aristotle, even though in the first book of the Politics, he says that he is perfectly capable of tolerating slavery, and he thinks women can't deliberate, because I know I could supply him with the data and the persuasive rhetoric that would change his mind. He is absolutely committed to constant revision of constitutions and relationships. He gives several examples of this, that in the light of new evidence. Interestingly, and I always want to tell the NRA this, one of the examples he gives of things we used to do in Greece until we decided it was a bad idea was bear arms in the assembly, right? We have learned to stop carrying weapons around in the city with our fellow citizens. It didn't work, okay? So we stopped it. And he gives many, many examples. And actually, beautifully, what he cites as the best bit of evidence about when it's noble to change your mind, it is not inconstant, right? It's the sign of a proper moral agent, is a tragedy called the Philoctetes, where it's a very brilliant tragedy, morally, but there's a young man called Neoptolemus who is told, he's a soldier, that he has to go and take a poor old man in agony off an island where he was long ago dumped in agony because he's needed again, because only he and his magic bow can end the Trojan War. And he must just go and get him by any means necessary. And Odysseus, who's very crafty in this play, forces him to go through with this. This is his orders. But Neoptolemus, when he talks to the old man, hears his story, hears his terrible pain, and this is a really grueling pain. He screams in pain for speech after speech. He says, no, I can now see this would be an immoral thing to do. And Odysseus tries actually highly utilitarian arguments, like the greater happiness of all the Greeks at Troy if we can end the war. Philoctetes simply won't do it. Sorry, Neoptolemus will not do it and promises Philoctetes that he'll take him home and look after him in his own home in his old age. And it's an incredibly beautiful moment because this young man stops doing what the father figure tells him and becomes a man morally and does the right thing in the light of this new data. And I just love the fact that Aristotle, who adored the theatre, is using that example. But to be happy, you have to do one thing that is very Platonic. On a lot of ethics, he's very different from his teacher Plato. You have to gnothe seauton. You have to know yourself. This is just an 18th century engraving of a young man not quite sure how to be happy and a sort of cherub appearing with a tablet that says, know yourself. But you have to start with your virtues and vices. The actual technical name for Aristotelian ethics is virtue ethics, which makes it sound really poncy and off-putting, virtue, and vice is even worse. It sounds like prostitution and drugs rings. But just bear with me. It just means good qualities and bad qualities, all right? Unfortunately, the words virtue and vice are very loaded. Aristotle, bless him, gives us, in his Eudemian ethics, an actual questionnaire. Are you ready for your questionnaire on yourself? Okay. But just before I go on to it, we have to just make it clear that this is not a dualistic system where you have virtue here and vice there. And although Stoics and Platonists and some Christians won't like this, it's part of the Aristotelian system that meant I could embrace this virtue, these ethics wholeheartedly. Instead of saying there is anger, and then there is non-anger, anger bad, non-anger good, yeah? Or there is carnal desire, bad, celibacy, virginity, purity, good. Instead of that, everything is on a spectrum, and you want to head exactly for the middle of the spectrum. People have often said to me, including a couple of very famous Aristotelian philosophers, they can't believe someone is so emotional and passionate as I am, which I am, and precipitate, all those things, can be an Aristotelian. And I want to say to them, it's because I'm all those things that I had to become an Aristotelian, because I couldn't deal with a system that didn't allow me to have and acknowledge and sometimes think highly useful things like anger or revenge or desire. What you're heading for is the middle. So he's very interested in the whole nexus around anger and envy and revenge. Of course, having too much anger is a bad thing. Too much anger will mean you're angry at inappropriate times with the wrong people. You will hit your child when it's your boss that has been yelling at you, right? You'll have anger that is not properly controlled at the right person. Then, though, you have on the opposite end of that spectrum no anger. And Aristotle is firmly of the belief that anybody incapable of anger cannot be an effective moral agent. And if they can't be an effective moral agent, they can't look after themselves or their dependents, and will never be happy. You actually need to be able to get angry to be happy. The point is that you have to use it to get yourself into court if somebody has smashed into your car and broken your legs, or if your child is being bullied. It's your soldier that helps you as the general. It gives you the energy to get up and act on the anger when you have been damaged. And he's absolutely clear that people who can't get angry at all will not make happy individuals or effective citizens. So with that sort of spectrum and the idea of going for the middle, here's just some of his principles from the Eudemian Ethics. And he actually gives you a table. So you can go through them. You can think, how do I feel about money, right? Now, you don't have to tell me what your answers would be, but if you're not honest with yourself, it won't work. You must know yourself. If you're not honest, you can't work on it and then get the fruits of happiness. Yeah? So, there is financial sense and integrity. There is avarice, which means you go around tricking other people and being obsessed with money. But there is a deficiency, which is just being stupid about money, which means anybody can exploit you, and that leads to very diseased relationships. You need to be able to stand up for yourself with integrity about your money. Very closely allied to that is how much should you give away? Okay? And he really actually doesn't usually tell us which way he's tending on these things. But Aristotle really hates mean people. You say mean with money. You say tight, don't you? You know what I mean? People who will not give any money away, especially rich ones. He hates them. And I've often wondered whether his father, who was a doctor, never gave him any pocket money. Or perhaps Philip of Macedon, when he hired him to teach Alexander the Great, didn't pay him properly. He really hates meanness with money, especially in the rich. He thinks generosity absolutely will help to make you happy, especially if you can afford it. But he's extremely worried about people who are prodigal with money. Again, because he says not only will they lose all their money so they can't look after their dependents and themselves, but they will be gullible and able to be manipulated, which will lead to problems in relationships, right? If they're seen as a pushover, that will make people think they can exploit them, and the whole set of relationships becomes more and more diseased. This one interests me because for ancient Greek masculinity, you're supposed to boast, right? All those warriors in Homer, boasting is supposed to be good, but he says, no, there's a median, which is just being very honest about yourself. If you know you're good at something, denying it is actually false modesty and, in its way, a fault. It sort of doesn't... And this is quite interesting because humility and faux self-denigration is very much in our culture, right? But actually, I think it can lead to problems. If you know you're good at something and a certain task comes up, it's good to be able to offer it confident, knowing that that's something that you're quite good at. It's also a very gendered thing, in that it's much easier for men to say, I'm really good at this, this, and this, without being seen to be, what would be the word? Women are much more easily accused of being arrogant and boastful. I love this one. So, just getting your daily manner. Are you a friendly person? Do you fawn on people to suck up to them? Or are you just extremely rude and uncooperative? We all know people of all those extremes. If you are on either extreme, Aristotle suggests you'll be happier if you learn just to be friendly and the same to everybody. Obsequiousness, again, groveling behaviour, no, no, no. But self-respect is fine, but don't get too arrogant. Or have I got those the wrong way round? I have, haven't I? Sorry, my vices are the wrong way round. Self-importance, magnanimity, pettiness, and then deviousness on one end, gullibility on the other, but there is just simple practical prudence in the middle. And you know what, it's just, you think, well, this is all so obvious and how sensible. Yes, it is. A lot of Aristotle's ethics is just glorified common sense. But when it comes to things like revenge and envy, which are some of the hardest things to control in life, I think, and I think this is particularly appropriate in academia, where, as we all know, the passions run so high when the stakes are so low. You know, tiny sums of travel grant. Somebody once decided not to be my friend after 25 years because I'd won a travel grant of £50 or something that they hadn't got. These are very, very, very big and difficult ones. And I had to be very, very honest when I did this on myself. My own greatest faults are precipitateness, wild extremes of emotion. I can be very rude, I admit it. I do tend to do it up the hill to superiors rather than down the hill. I bully uphill, if you know what I mean. But I've certainly done it in inappropriate ways at times. But the real killer for me is I'm extremely vindictive. Picking an argument with a line manager, boss, who, because he's got power, even if he's trying to exercise it in a good way. You know, just because I can't, I have problems with authority even when it's being exercised. And I've had to learn. I have made myself, and it has made me happy. And I have fitted better in since I stopped being quite so automatically uncooperative with authority. But revenge has been the one I've had to really work on. I spent a very great deal of my life harbouring, my young life, grievances, which just locks you in the past. Again, though, Aristotle says people who have no desire for revenge cannot be proper moral agents. And he's very honest about this. So if someone has maliciously damaged you, or your child, or your dependent, or your loved one, then actually, and this is where we do leave Christianity, I think, you do not turn the other cheek if you're an Aristotelian. I could never do that. I think if you deserve reparation and public acknowledgement that you have been damaged, then it is perfectly legitimate. And I found this much, much easier to work with. The trouble is when it then takes over your life that you basically spend all your time brooding on all the horrible things that have happened to you because people are jerks, let's face it. So you're not free of it. And I learned with Aristotle, that really living well, wellness, fulfilling myself, having the happiest life I could, is in a way the best revenge. If somebody wanted to do you real damage and doesn't want you to be happy, then just going away and being happy regardless of what they've done. Do you see what I mean? But anyway, I won't go on about that anymore because you have to do your own. Advanced ethics, how am I doing? Another 5 minutes. I haven't really got much time. He's incredibly big on intentions as the test of ethical action, that it's not the consequences, but it's the intentions. He's very interesting on when it's okay to lie. He thinks that the default position for everybody's happiness is honesty, for very good reasons. One is that he wants you to be an authentic, a person who is true to yourself, which means you're going to be the same all the time to everybody. You've found your true person. And if you're the same all the time to everybody, then you can't be lying to one person and, right, there is a true you with truth, so you will be happier. But he says, obviously, if somebody's about to kill your family and a lie would get them out of prison, then you tell the lie. I mean, and I found this very helpful bringing up my children. Instead of punishing them for a lie, we've always sat down and decided, was the person you were lying to, could they have helped you if you'd told them the truth, or were they trying to hurt you? The kids are quite capable of this, quite capable of it. If my kids lie to me, when I will always do everything I can to help them, then I won't be able to help them very effectively if I don't have the right information. On the other hand, if somebody, stranger, asked them to get into the car and they said, I can't, I've got to be home in 2 minutes, when they didn't, I would reward them for that lie. I would think, thank heavens, they can think on their feet and defend themselves. It's the same with omission. Aristotle was the first person we know of ever, this comes into the Catholic theology, but don't ask yourself at the end of the day, did I manage to keep my nose clean, keep out of trouble, but what have I actually done with all the opportunities for helping people and doing good? And this has been very, very important to me. It's very, very easy to just comfort yourself with the fact that you've kept out of trouble, especially once I got tenure. Right? Once you've got tenure and you've got some money and some security, if you don't speak up for people who haven't, then you are actually arrogating a very important responsibility from a very secure position. So that is how I assess politicians. I don't say, did they manage to not say anything racist today? It's like, what have they done? And I find the cult of rich people and celebrities who do nothing with those positions deeply upsetting. I haven't got time for equity, but I'd like to. I haven't really got time for any more of it, actually. But all of this expands out into relationships, friendships, and the easiest way to, I'm just tantalizing you, you do want to know that the Greeks are very, very keen on Aristotle at the moment because of his general ethical principles. This is a graffiti up in Athens where they're unbelievably poor at the moment, where he's saying, which he did, poverty is the parent of revolution and crime. He did say that. And in Saloniki, they're on this thing called the 700 euros protest, that 700 euros a month is the absolute minimum you can live on in Greece. That, the organisations for poverty action have, so that's the 700 euros protest. They do it at the statue of Aristotle in Thessalonica. Isn't that lovely? That I'm going to just end with potential. I have leapt all the way through politics, but I'm fascinated by, this is Martin Luther King's last sermon in his own church in Alabama on the New Year's Day before he was shot. But he actually takes the idea of potential and makes it a reciprocal, universal thing. And this ties up with omission and commission. It's not good enough just to fulfill your own potential, all right? Unless you actively try to help everybody else fulfill their own potential, then you're not fulfilling your potential, right? And that is, in a sense, an advance on the Aristotelian dunamis position. And he said, I don't want you to forget, he said to his own children, that there are millions of God's children who will not and cannot get a good education, but you will never be what you ought to be until they are what they ought to be. And that, I really feel I can feel Aristotle's head nodding in absolute agreement. It's not enough to go and be the best possible you, because the best possible you actually means helping other people to be the best possible them. So that's it. Thank you.